Again, this is Julie Keegan from Disability Rights New York. We're the protection and advocacy system for New York State. Every state and territory has a protection and advocacy system. And our function is to provide legal services and advocacy to people with disabilities. And that includes people with all kinds of disabilities for issues that they encounter across their lifespan. One of the issues that we have been looking at for about a year now and seeing an increase in the number of requests for our students who are being placed on home instruction while they're waiting for a educational placement. We receive a lot of requests for help in these cases, and we have been helping people on an individual basis, but also because of the scope of the problem, looking at it systemically. So we thought that this would be a helpful presentation for people to just understand what the law requires in terms of procedure and process, strategies to address issues if a child is on home instruction and waiting for a placement, and including how to keep a child in their current placement instead of perhaps a more restrictive placement. So with that in mind, I will just conduct some meeting housekeeping here while I admit some more people. We are using the first hour for the presentation by my colleagues, and then the last half hour we've reserved for questions and answers. Questions should be posted in the chat. They will go directly to me. We do not have an open chat for this event just because there are so many people attending today.
I'm doing
I will be
captioning right now, but
can everyone put themselves on mute, please? Thank you. I will be keeping track of those questions and posing them to our speakers in that last half hour. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Please try to make your questions sort of general, because providing a lot of individual facts may not be a productive use of the time that we have together today. I also want to tell you that there should be live captioning in Spanish at the top of the screen if you are able to see that. We will be providing the PowerPoint in this presentation to everyone by email at the conclusion or later today. You will also receive an email to complete an evaluation. We request that you do that so we can learn more about your feedback on this presentation and how we can improve it, and also ideas for other things that you might want to learn about. So we appreciate that. And we will be, as you know, we are recording this event, and we will be making it available in the future to folks who weren't able to make it today, or anyone else who wants to view it. I don't have a timeline for that, but we will try to turn it around as soon as possible. And we will notify you when that link is available. So I think that concludes my housekeeping. And so I'd like to introduce my colleagues who will be providing this presentation today. That includes Alyssa Galea, who's a senior attorney here at Disability Rights New York, and Laura Marks, who is a staff attorney here at Disability Rights New York. So I will turn it over to them, and I appreciate everyone's attendance today.
Great, thank you. Like Julie said, I'm Laura Marks, and today we are going to go through waiting for an educational placement. And Alyssa, do you want to turn it to the, thank you. This is just an overview of the topics that we're going to discuss today. It's the least restrictive environment, the continuum, strategies, and remedies, and these will all make more sense as we move along. The governing laws and regulations include the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the New York State Part 200 of the New York regulations. Okay. And then for the least restrictive environment, this is also referred to as LRE throughout the presentation, and it may be referred to as LRE at a student's Committee on Special Education meeting. This refers to a student's placement along with the related services, both of which will be covered throughout this presentation. It is important to appreciate that the least restrictive environment is not a specific place or classroom. The specific classroom can change and it can still be considered the LRE. The LRE is the most appropriate, although not always the perfect placement that allows a student to be educated in the general education setting to the to the maximum extent that is appropriate. That's important to really hone in on, is that it's to the maximum extent appropriate to each individual student. You want to go to the next slide, Alyssa?
All right, so we're gonna hop in here and start with our discussion of the continuum of educational services. So that is the term that we use, that the state uses to talk about the range of placements and services that exist. So if you think about all of the different types of settings that a special education student might have in their IEP, we could start out, they might be in a general education classroom and just have some services and supports in there, all the way to someone who's on home instruction and is not going to school and not in a class with their peers at all. This is the aerographic you see is what the state education department has decided is the order of restrictiveness that the placements go into. And we'll just note as well that it's not required, depending on the student's individual circumstances, that they try each and every placement in order along this continuum. Depending on their individual needs, it might be immediately apparent that something more or less restrictive is what's most appropriate for them. They don't have to try every single one. That being said, if we're looking at someone taking extreme jumps between placements on different parts of the continuum, we're going to want a lot more evidence as to why that significant of a move is appropriate for them. In this graphic, we'll talk about these in more detail over the next couple slides, but just goes to show some more information about the specific range of placements that exist that a special education student might find themselves in.
Sorry. First, we're going to talk about integrated co-teaching services. And this is a classroom that has two teachers, one of whom is a special education and one is a general education teacher. So students who are in this classroom who have disabilities are educated with their peers who do not have disabilities and who do not have an IEP. So it's still important in the integrated co-teaching classroom for students to be grouped based on similarity and need. And this is something that you're going to see as a thread throughout every placement, is the grouping of students by similarity of need. Next slide, Alyssa. This special class is also called a self-contained classroom. This is what I think a lot of people may be most familiar with when they think of special education. This is a separate classroom that is only for students who have disabilities, who also have an IEP. These students must be grouped based on their needs as well. One thing to note here with respect to grouping based on needs is that there can be multiple classrooms. For instance, a 12-1-1, which is it's the number of students with the number of teachers and the number of support staff. They can not be interchangeable. So a 12-1-1 is not equal to another 12-1-1. If one 12-1-1 classroom serves students with one specific need, a student who doesn't meet into that grouping isn't necessarily going to receive an appropriate education if placed into that group of students. And then this is an out-of-district day program. This can get a little confusing if you're familiar with BOCES, because BOCES can be both in-district and out-of-district. It can also be out-of-district in an in-district school building. This is also private programming, and if a student is receiving their education at a neighboring school district, it is still out-of-district, even though they're in a public school. This may be appropriate for a student after they've been given a chance in an in-district placement with appropriate supports and services to help them succeed. And that's really important to kind of highlight, is that before we move to out of district, we want to be sure that the student was supported. And then again, BOCES programs are commonly out of district, even if the BOCES program is located inside your student's in-district school. And BOCES programs can also be attended by students who don't have IEPs. BOCES is an entire presentation worth of information, so we're not going to go into that level of detail, but just something to note with out-of-district programs.
So then we'll talk about residential placements, which of course by definition are out-of-district programs. There is a list that the State Education Department maintains of state-approved private residential programs. And you might hear them called other names like boarding schools or therapeutic placements. It's also important to note that there are some programs that provide housing and education that are affiliated with state agencies. For instance, the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, but not all of those programs are CSE placements. So if you are a parent of a child or working with a student who is working with different state agencies that are involved in their services and care, it's important to talk to their case manager or care manager about options and processes there. We're going to strictly be talking about school-based placements that go through the Committee on Special Education in this presentation, and we're not going to be getting into the type of placements that might exist if a state agency or social service agency is the one who's responsible for the placement. When residential placements are appropriate is a question that comes up and has been decently litigated. Residential placements, the long and short of it is they have to be necessary for the student to meet their educational needs. So that kind of milieu of services that exists both in and outside the school environment has to really be necessary for that student to be making educational progress and meeting the goals in their IEP. There's always the goal of these students, returning back to their homes and communities. So the school district is responsible for creating a plan and putting some time-based goals in place to try. It doesn't happen, of course, 100% of the time, but the goal should always be to do whatever they can to ideally have that student transition back into a day community-based program at some point. And then the most restrictive placement identified along the continuum is home and hospital instruction. Might also hear this called homebound instruction. And it's important to know that we're not talking about homeschooling, where a parent or family member voluntarily says, I'm gonna, become the person responsible for my child or student's education. We're talking about the scenarios in which the school district is the one who makes the student's placement, either their home or a hospital setting. We're not going to read a ton in this presentation, but just to highlight this quote from a recent state complaint decision. that home and hospital instruction is the most restrictive placement and is reserved for students who are unable to attend school in person due to physical, mental, or emotional illness or injury. So at least on paper, it's supposed to be reserved for kind of those most extreme cases where there's a physical or mental health reason why an in-person school placement is not going to be appropriate for that student at this time. I seem to have lost my cursor. There we go.
So this is really the, what is the issue? Why are we here today? This is the rift in the continuum, meaning the continuum is not working the way that it is supposed to. What we're seeing is that students are receiving a placement during their CSE meeting. A lot of times that's a placement that the parent or guardian agrees to. And then that student is placed on home instruction while waiting for that placement or a spot to become available. Those students are placed on home instruction for an undetermined amount of time, a lot of times. And it is something that all parties agree to is not the least restrictive environment for that student. For example, a student was receiving their education in an 811. The CSE team goes to annual review, and everyone agrees that an out-of-district placement is more appropriate for that specific student. There is no disagreement with respect to placement, so they take steps to move forward to have that student placed in an out-of-district placement. While they are waiting for a placement to become available for that student, they are sitting at home instruction, not receiving an appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And then you'll see as our final bullet point, we don't have one answer for why this is happening. We don't necessarily have one great answer. Some contributing factors include that there aren't enough spots for students or there aren't enough teachers. That combined with the fact that students need to be grouped based on their individual needs, it all kind of boils up to this long wait list, these students who are sitting on home instruction when they should be in a less restrictive placement. And again, just by way of example, an 811 at a school that specializes in educating students with autism spectrum disorder is probably not going to be an appropriate placement for a student with a learning disability who also needs an 811. So when that first spot becomes available, a student on home instruction who should be being placed in an 811 is not going to be an appropriate fit, and they are going to have to continue to wait. All right.
So now we're going to move on and talk about some of the strategies that can be employed when we're looking at a potential change in placements for a student in special education. So we've broken this section down a little further and are gonna kind of come at this from 3 different angles. So the first idea is keeping students in their appropriate placement. So when a student is in a class right now and you're feeling like that is where they should be, how to avoid an unnecessary move. Then we're going to examine the scenario in which perhaps people do agree that a change in placement is appropriate. What are some things we can do to try and make sure that a new appropriate placement is found in a timely manner for that student? And then the third thing we're going to focus on this section is the rights of students during that placement transition process. All right. So, like we said, first we'll examine when the current placement is appropriate. So, going back to kind of the basics, It's really important for everyone to be kind of on the same page from the get-go. If we're starting to think about potentially changing a student's placement, well, why? Why is, the CSE discussing that? Why does the teacher feel that's necessary? What kind of things are going wrong that are making people hesitant about that student staying in their current placement? And what are the potential things that can be employed in order to improve that placement and make that placement better, give that student a higher chance of success? So there are kind of two different potential big issues here. So first, what does the IEP look like right now? And is it being implemented appropriately? Because the best IEP in the world, right, is not going to be successful for a student if they're not actually getting the services and supports that are in that IEP. Conversely, we might have an IEP that needs additional work, needs additional supports for the student in order to improve that program and make it successful for them. That includes things, right, like additional modifications or accommodations that they might need, additional services and supports. And, from probably most people who've encountered this issue, right, their experience is that behavior is often a big one here, but a student with challenging behaviors, we have to first say, well, what did you try to in order to, try and alleviate those behaviors and help support that student before automatically jumping to the idea that a more restrictive placement might be appropriate. And so this includes things like updated functional behavior assessments, changing the behavior plan. Honestly, is there even a behavior plan? We've heard schools say that, well, we have a school-wide, kind of system, but really, what is the individualized plan that supports that student's particular behavioral needs and the motivators that work as rewards for them? Just generally, have we tried everything that we can reasonably try in this setting in order to try and make it work before we make that decision that a new change in placement is going to be what's best appropriate here?
So, like Alyssa said, these are supports and services that we're going to go through that may be appropriate for a student who maybe the CSE team thinks that the current placement is not appropriate because they are not succeeding. And these are supports and services that can be considered to be used in conjunction with their placement to make sure that the student really does stay in the least restrictive environment. The first one is consultant teacher services. So this is a student who's in a general education classroom, and the consultant teacher services can be hands-on, meaning that the teacher is in the classroom with the gen ed teacher, or they can be behind the scenes. So the special education teacher is there to provide support to the gen ed teacher in creating the curriculum and planning for the students who have disability. And then the gen ed teacher is the one in the classroom with the students. The next one is the resource room program. This is for students who need a little extra support. Again, these are small groups that are students who are grouped by need. The students who are in these small groups have to have similar needs. And this isn't necessarily a content class. This is a space to reinforce what a student has been learning in their classrooms, that maybe they need a little extra reinforcement or a little extra instruction on. This can reinforce not only classroom content, algebra or English, whatever it is, but it can also reinforce strategies to help that student really cope with being in the classroom. It can be study strategies, note-taking strategies, things like that. And then I just want to highlight the group by similar need is listed out here on kind of what the considerations are when grouping students together. Okay. Supplementary aids and services, I think, is probably something that a lot of people really do think about when they think about special education, because these are the supports and services that, are speech pathology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, but they also include a broader range of supports and services that maybe a lot of people don't think about. And those can include assistive technology services and psychological services, as well as services for the parent to help assist in the education. These are meant to support a student, and they're generally not, they don't have any academic content to them. I guess I should say purely academic content. These can be pull-out services, so a student can be taken out of their classroom to receive services, or they can be push-in services where the provider or service goes into the classroom with the student. And these can really be used to target a specific need. Sorry, Alyssa. All right, and then this is another, I think, hot topic, which is teaching assistants and teaching aides. You can see the difference between the two of them within their definitions provided by the regulations is the instructional role or lack thereof between the assistant and the aide. These are supports that can be in the classroom, and they can be specific to one student, more than one student, or the classroom itself. And if you want more guidance and more information on one-to-one aids, where there's one aid for one student, there is guidance on the New York State Education Department website that you can check out. And then this slide really is just an overview of what Alyssa and I spoke about. This is a slide of what can be tried, what is worth talking about with the CSE team, what is worth considering to help support a student, to make sure that student has been given every opportunity to have the supports and services that they need in order to stay in the least restrictive environment that is appropriate to that student.
Okay, so now we're going to shift into our second kind of piece of this section is when a change in placement is believed to be appropriate. So when a change in placement is needed, there needs to be a search for what that appropriate placement is going to be. And so during that process, there are some strategies that we've seen employed, some of them, right, pretty successfully in terms of trying to bolster that referral and find the most appropriate program for that student and improve their chances of being accepted to that program. So one thing we look at, right, is the evaluations. If a student has not been evaluated in some time, even if they're not due for their triennial evaluations quite yet, or if there's been some sort of significant changes since their last evaluation, maybe it's new behaviors that no one has really seen from them before, or a significant increase, maybe they've developed an additional disability due to illness or injury. If there's just been a significant change, we might want to get some more clinical opinions on their needs. If they're a student who maybe has some challenging looking things on paper that don't accurately, really reflect that whole student and their experience. We have seen some schools kind of submit a cover letter in the referral explaining, here are the key things you need to know about this student and what their needs are and how they thrive in school. Related to that, when schools are sending out these referrals, they're sending the entire educational file in most cases for a period of time. So if there is some challenging behavioral information or things like that in there, there are not things that you can ask just to, oh, don't put their disciplinary records, in the referral. You have to be still complete and honest about what's in those records. But to the extent that, if there are explanations, if there are, students started a new medication and we've really seen a decrease in their behavior since then, whatever kind of additional information that helps provide that helpful context, including that in kind of a prominent place in the referral can be helpful. And then just in generally when we're going through this placement search, depending on what type of advocacy you want to do also depends on where in the process you're at. The advice for someone who's just starting out might be a little different than someone who has been in kind of the process for a while and not getting successful results and acceptances in places. I think, one of the most important things for this process, though, is just trying to keep those open lines of communication throughout the entire process. So both with your home CSE team, as well as any related service providers, and then any schools that are reaching out to potentially discuss and consider accepting a new student, making sure that the family members and the student, if they're at an age level where it's appropriate for them, are getting their questions answered, are able to get information so everybody, as best as they can, stays on the same page and has nothing that they're confused about or feel like they're missing out on. So next we want to talk about, advocacy when that student is put on home instruction while they're waiting for that placement. Unfortunately, we've seen this as kind of a short-term thing, and we've seen this also in some cases go on for literally years. And one of the challenges, right, is if it depends in some part as to the setting that the student came out of, because a district, right, can make the choice to put a student back in their own district-based setting that they have operational control over. But when we're seeing students who are removed from private placements, the school district doesn't have as much direct control, right? They can't order a private placement to serve their student. But that, of course, does not let the district off the hook for the services and education that they're supposed to be providing. So, it's not an excuse if they're not doing education for that student at all. Some districts are struggling to find, like tutors for remote or no tutors for home instruction. So they'll be like, oh, well, we found this remote program, this remote something. And, if we always recommend that if that's not a way that's going to be accessible education to that student, then advocacy for in-person services, whatever those might look like in the interim, could be a better solution, right? Some students do thrive with virtual programming, but for a lot of students with significant needs, that might not be accessible to them. So that's a big one. And then we have listed out on the slide the types of education and services that students are entitled to while they're on home instruction. And so we always recommend to parents and families right from the start to start keeping a log. And anytime the district is failing to provide that education, if it takes some time for them to hire a tutor, if there is a period of time where the related service provider is on vacation and unavailable, to make note of any sessions that are missed, not on the part of your family child. If the kid has strep throat and can't do school for a week, that's one thing. But if it's a district-based failure to provide any of the sessions they're entitled to make sure that you keep a written record of that. And the final thing that we'll say on this slide is, while a student is on home instruction, especially if they're a student who was someone who was trying to work on goals related to social skills, or appropriate community behavior, or for any student really, to see if there are any additional opportunities to get them with other students, other peers their age, just so that they're not completely isolated and still have that opportunity to see other people, whether that's in a community or recreational setting, or going to a tutoring session at school for their 2 or 3 hours a day and eating lunch with their peers, whatever that might look like, to see if there are any options for making sure that they don't end up completely isolated for the period that they're on home instruction. And then we will just talk briefly about unilateral parental placements, because this is an option as well. But these are placements, right, where they're not coming from the CSE team and the school district is not the one that's recommending them. These are typically not, state approved schools that the school district would apply to. These are private schools that the parent seeks out and applies to themselves. Of course, any parent, right, has the right to private pay and place their student in a private setting if that's what they so choose. Understanding, right, that of course finances can be a barrier to a lot of people doing this. So there is a legal process for seeking reimbursement for unilateral private placements. We listed out, the requirements here. So, reimbursement has to start with the school district not being able to provide an appropriate placement. But it's just important to know that this can get really complicated really fast, and, potentially has being on the financial hook for the cost of whatever that placement is, because the reimbursement is not guaranteed unless you win. So if this is something that a family is considering as an option for them, we just really recommend consulting with an attorney or getting legal representation to help guide you through this process if it's a route that you're planning to go down.
All right, so this is the third piece of our strategies section, and this we're really talking about students who've already been placed on home instruction awaiting a placement. This is a non-exhaustive list. I want to be very clear that this is not exhaustive of all the things that should be considered. But these are things to think about when a student has been placed on home instruction indefinitely. And a student should be receiving education and services while on home instruction. And these can be worded differently in an IEP or the prior written notice. I've seen in an IEP a student's placement say what their agreed upon placement is, but that the placement that we're waiting to find. And the prior written notice to the parents saying we're placing the student on home instruction while waiting for that placement. So things to consider, what can the student do in the school? How can they be included with their peers in their education? Is there a part of the day that they really were succeeding at? And if so, can they go to school for that portion of the day? Can they, go for a couple hours in the morning and then, go home and receive the rest of their education that way? It's really going to be an independent evaluation of that student and what is working, what is not working, and really how can we, to the greatest extent possible, get this student back into school, back into the setting that will allow them to be in a less restrictive environment than home instruction. And then this is the big one. This is reporting to the New York State Education Department. This is the responsibility of the school district. And what the report is that the student is not receiving the education in the appropriate placement because that placement currently doesn't exist, meaning that a spot doesn't exist or the placement itself does not exist. Both are possible. NYSED is supposed to provide oversight to the districts and to provide support to allow the districts to give the education to students in the least restrictive environment. So that's why the report to NYSED is really important. It notifies NYSED that these things are happening, we need help, and these students are sitting on home instruction really not receiving what they're supposed to be receiving and what they're entitled to. Some things to keep in mind with this is to follow up with the district about whether or not they have reported this gap to NYSED. And if they have not, question that, ask why that hasn't happened, when it's going to happen. And then if they have, ask them, has there been any follow-up? Has there been any response? And I would encourage everybody to keep things in writing so that you have for your own records a kind of a timeline of when things have been happening, of when you first had the report to NYSED, when the district has followed up, et cetera, as far as the process of getting the student off of home instruction. Just being sure that you know and you have a tangible timeline of your efforts.
All right, so now we're going to move into some of the remedies and some of the processes that are available for students who find themselves waiting in an inappropriate setting. So briefly, the things we'll discuss in this section are CSE meetings, the Quality Assurance Office, complaints, mediation, and due process and compensatory education. So we will start out with CSE meetings. So this might seem kind of silly to include in here as a potential remedy, because let's face it, a lot of people are gonna say like, that was the first thing I tried, guys. But really, going back to what we said before with the importance of open lines of communication, and making sure that everyone, to the best extent possible, is on the same page about what the student needs, what this goal placement is, and what problems or delays are happening in that process. And so, we don't need to be waiting until it's annual review time every year to get the team together. If there are issues or progress updates that need to be discussed, you can request a meeting at any time. And that's also a great opportunity to talk about the need for newer updated evaluations, newer updated supports, and making sure that you're getting those prior written notices from all of your meetings that explain from the school, why they accepted or rejected certain proposals, so that you can, always keep in mind building that paper trail, right? Because the best possible solution is that everybody can get along and work together and make decisions together to solve the issue. But if all else fails, having a paper trail of all of the options that were tried can only, better serve you in the long run.
Right, so this is the State Education Quality Assurance, and you might hear this referred to as CEQA. And they can provide students or their families or supports with resources or guidance, but they're not going to be providing the direct hand-in-hand assistance to find a resolution. They can investigate complaints, but again, they're not going to be the one to resolve the individual issue for your student. So this is really, if there is an issue, you can certainly report to CEQA so that they are able to investigate, but this is probably not your strategy if you're looking for a resolution or hand-in-hand assistance to a resolution.
All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about state complaints. So this is a little more formal and different, right, than just a phone call to CEQA for some technical assistance. This is, your written, signed out allegations that your school district is violating the law by failing to offer your student a free and appropriate public education. There's a 1-year timeline for any incidents. So, I mean, conceivably you'd be interested in filing much sooner than that, but you can make allegations going back a year in time. And then after the state receives that complaint, they have 60 calendar days that they'll investigate, get written documentation from the district and make their decision. State complaints are particularly useful when we're talking about procedural violations. So for instance, that the CSE meeting, didn't occur before a change in placement was recommended, or that input was excluded from a meeting, or that home instruction, is being recommended and implemented in violation of the law about when home instruction is appropriate. Things like that. If there's a real fact-based dispute about what that student's appropriate educational placement actually is, a state complaint might not be the best route to go. The thing about state complaints is that they are a lot simpler and I'll say more user-friendly to file than a due process complaint necessarily is. And state complaints can pretty easily be done without an attorney. They don't have a hearing or any sort of in-person procedure attached to them. It's really a document-based process, so it's easier for a parent or advocate to do on their own without getting representation. And you can submit IEPs, correspondence, any kind of written examples of the issue that you have along with your complaint when you file it. The hyperlink will work when you get the paper copy of the presentation materials, but on the state ed website, they have a sample state complaint form. Let me see, we have a picture for you on the next slide. I'm sure that's kind of small. But basically, they ask for a lot of demographic information and then a description of your allegations, the proposed resolution. You don't have to get into the specifics of what laws were violated or things like that. You can really do a more general explanation of the issues and of what would be your intended resolution in order to assist there. The other thing we'll talk about in this section is mediation. And so that is a free and voluntary process that either the parent or the district can seek. Basically, right to have an impartial party help the two sides have a conversation so that they can discuss the issues and come up with a solution. It doesn't preclude, a hearing or a complaint being filed later on. Everything is voluntary, but you're still going to want to keep in mind those timelines that apply to both state and due process complaints if that's something, you're hoping to keep available as an option to you. In general, mediation, right, could be helpful for anyone to talk about the issues. We find it's probably most successful when there's some room for middle ground, in those cases where the school and the family really have kind of acrimonious relationships and there's been a humongous breakdown in communication and things aren't moving forward. I'm never going to discourage someone from pursuing mediation, but it's I think most useful when the parties are willing to hear each other out and maybe need some assistance in communicating more effectively with one another or looking at things in a different way in order to try and get on the same page and figure out what's going to be best for that student.
So Alyssa did bring up due process complaints when talking about the about the state complaint. So the due process complaint is really to address disagreements, typically between the family and the district. And for this, there is a 2-year time frame in which you need to file the complaint. And I just want to highlight some of the kind of situations here. A due process complaint, if you're talking about a student who's been placed on home instruction and the student's not receiving any education or any services while on home instruction, or that are included in the IEP, or the parent disagrees with the proposed placement, then that might be where the due process complaint comes in. When we're talking about the issue where a student is placed on home instruction waiting for a placement that's not coming, this really is not likely to be the best path forward into getting that placement. The hearing officer really doesn't have the ability to resolve that situation for you. And so then with respect to the due process complaint, this last bullet point here is pendency. So when you're filing a due process complaint, a student might be entitled to stay in the last placement that was in their IEP that the CSE team, including the parents, agreed to. And this means that if there's a disagreement about what the appropriate placement for that student is, at the annual review or whenever, the family, for example, can file the due process complaint, and the student might be entitled to stay in that previous placement that is not in the proposed IEP, but is in that previous IEP that was enacted for purposes of the example in the previous school year. All right, and then with that comes compensatory education. And while the name may indicate that it's just education services, this does include education as well as support services that a student is entitled to per their IEP. This, however, is a remedy after the student has already lost out on education or services. In the example above, where students on home instruction and they're not actually receiving their education or services that they're entitled to that are in their IEP, they may be able to get compensatory education. It's not going to be a full day of compensatory education for the day that the student missed. It may seem discouraging, I think. Sometimes we see families who think that the compensatory education isn't necessarily enough to make up for what the student missed. But we do have this compensatory education guide that has a lot more information about compensatory education specifically. And you'll notice that it is a COVID guide. It was a resource developed towards, the beginning of COVID, but the principles of compensatory education that are in that guide are still applicable now, regardless of COVID.
All right, so we want to conclude this part by talking about systemic efforts, because everything we've gone through so far has been a lot of individual advocacy, which is super important and often is the quickest way to get a solution for each specific student. However, it's really our position from the things that we've been experiencing that there's a problem here that is bigger than something, that each individual family or advocate for a student knocking the issues off one by one is really going to make the type of overarching change that we think is probably going to be needed in order to keep this happening in the future. Keep this from happening in the future. We know that home instruction is being used inappropriately, and we know that some school districts, are aware that they're using it inappropriately and are doing so because they don't feel like they have other options. And that doesn't let them off the hook, but suggests that, they need additional supports and assistance on a state level, perhaps in accessing programs that would be appropriate to serve their students' needs. So one of our goals at this point is to really make sure that the state is aware of the problem and of the scope of the problem. You know, Laura mentioned earlier as one of the strategies, you know, making sure that your school district has notified the state ed if they have not been able to find an appropriate placement for a student, and the New York State education law requires them to do that. But we currently have reason to believe that state ed is not actually, you know, collecting this information in a meaningful way and using that, you know, to act on any policy changes right yet. So one of the things that we are doing that will be officially launching as a result of this presentation today is that we have developed a survey, and I know you probably can't access the link in the PowerPoint, but it'll be shared with you probably multiple times, let's be honest, after this presentation. But what we are really hoping and asking folks to assist us with is if you are a parent or family member, a school personnel, an advocate, basically anyone who's in connection with a student who is experiencing or has recently experienced this issue, we'd really like to collect information about that experience, what's been tried, you know, the scope of the problem to help better inform ourselves and hopefully collect data that we can anonymously present to the state, and hopefully have a real meaningful conversation with them, you know, about what our clients, about what students across the state are experiencing, to try and push for some real change on a system-wide level to combat this issue and find solutions to make sure that the appropriate placements that students need are practically available to them. We think it should take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete the survey. You can do it, you know, if you're a teacher who has 2 students, right, in this scenario, you can fill out 2 different surveys. And again, we will make sure that that link gets shared with everyone, you know, probably in the chat, along with the registration, not the registration, the presentation materials that we'll send out to all of the registrants. And we just ask for, and well, thank you in advance for your assistance in completing this and helping us to be more informed and in turn inform the state about this issue. And I am super impressed with our staying on timing as we went through the slides. We're going to keep the PowerPoint up, I think, just so that we don't lose the Spanish version of the captioning, but I know that Julie has been monitoring the chat for questions, and so I think we are good to move into that section now.
Thank you, Alyssa and Laura. That was super informative, and I am incredibly impressed that you were able to share all that information in such a short time. So we are opening it to questions, and I have been monitoring the chat, and I believe there's some more coming in as well. I also put the link to the survey in the chat, so you can access it there if you need it, and we really hope people will complete that survey. I think Alyssa